Hi guys, it's Sophie. We have a massive wrap up here. So September I got my arse in gear and I've started reading my way through the books that I have on my TBR ahead of my Around the World challenge next year. I'm going to be pushing pretty hard for the last 3 months of the year to try and get that finished, if I possibly can. So yeah, this is going to be a really long video. I've decided to make my fiction and non-fiction together and just have a really nice long chat with you all, I suppose. So we're going to kick things off with fiction, and I'm just going to go through a random order, however they're piled up beside me. So the first one I have to talk about is Swing Time by Zadie Smith. Now I've had this on my TBR for a really long time. This is actually the book that had been on my TBR for the longest, because I got this one for Christmas last year. And I kind of been putting it off because I heard some really mixed things. I think I probably enjoyed this book more than most people did from the reviews I've seen. It's basically a book that's kind of about dance, but more about, I think, female friendship than anything else. It also kind of plays around with ideas of race and race politics and I guess the way that people are seen when they are kind of ardent sort of civil rights activists, I suppose. But the central sort of thing going through this is the relationship between these women and their kind of interaction with other people in the world, and how different lives can go such different ways. I did enjoy it, as I say. I did think that it was such a character-based thing for me that I did find it a little bit slow at times. I wished there had been a little bit more of a push, I guess. It did just kind of falter a little bit in the middle, but overall I liked it, and I liked the kind of messages and themes it played with. And the next one, unfortunately, I didn't get on with so well, and that was Men Without Women by Haruki Murakami. This is his new collection of short stories, and it's kind of broadly focused around the idea of men being somewhat estranged from women. There's lots of different context that plays in. It's kind of like breakups or long-term illness or I guess kind of a lack of interest in associating with women at all. And whilst I like that as an idea, I wasn't all that enamoured with it. I didn't think that many of the short stories stood out. There was one I liked that was about a man who set up a bar in what used to be his aunt's house, and he sort of becomes plagued by these signs. That was good. But the rest of them I just didn't really enjoy. There were parts in here that were very much men are like this, women are like this, which I'm kind of done with. So yeah, I gave this one 2 stars. I didn't think it was awful, but I didn't like it. And the next one I read was Strange Heart Beating by Goldstone. This is one that was on my 5-star predictions video. I ended up giving it 4 stars, but it was still pretty good. It's basically about a man whose wife is killed in a kind of freak accident with a swan, and he realises after this accident that he doesn't really know his wife, and he never really knew all of her, especially her childhood. So she didn't grow up in the UK, she moved, and he goes back to her country of birth and starts associating with people that she knew when she was a little girl, and kind of finds this whole other side to his wife, and it's kind of about him dealing with not really knowing everything about his wife, and now that she's gone, there's no way for him to ask her anything else. I thought it was an interesting kind of conversation about grief and about, more than anything, kind of the ownership that we feel over people that we're in relationships with, and how that could potentially run away with a person when that person has died, because there's no way to get any new information from that person, so there's a need to kind of try and understand everything that you had up to that point. So yeah, I did enjoy it. I did feel as though, again, it was a little bit slow. That's why it didn't get 5 stars, is just because it kind of felt like it could have been shorter. It's quite a short book, but I still felt it could have been shorter and done fairly similar things. And I also thought that the ending, it just felt a little bit rushed, I guess, to me. And then next I have a collection of short stories by the lovely Joan Campbell. This is The Beginning of the World and the End of the Night. This is the proof copy. I did really like this book. I thought the stories were all really different, which was quite refreshing, and I read it in one go. I just sat down and ate the entire thing up. My favourite story was the title story, The Beginning of the World and the Middle of the Night. I just thought it was really clever and really sad, and it did sort of, I don't know, I read it twice. Like, I read it and then I read it again, and it just, I don't know, it felt very intimate and very sad. But I did like a lot of these stories. There's one that's quite fun about sort of, I guess, children who are kind of half plant and half children, and I really like that one as well. It made me very tempted, though I didn't. In the like blogger pack, you sent like a bean, and I was like, I'm gonna eat the bean, and I was like, no, that's mad, you can't eat the bean. But it kind of plays with that fear you have when you're a kid of someone being like, oh, you can't eat an apple seed or a tree will grow inside you. Yeah, it was really good. I think obviously lots of people have been chatting about this as well, but it's genuinely just a really nice story collection that is kind of fairy tales but without the whimsy, I guess, which I think is very Jen. And the next one I have is one that I started when I was 17 and I've only just finished, not all in one go. Basically I started it, lost the book, and then never got around to buying it again, and saw it really cheap and thought, do you know what, I'm just going to read it. And that is The Wasp Factory by Ian Banks. And this is a story about a disturbed young man who lives on an isolated sort of island off of Scotland, and he is very violent. It's kind of got a little bit of that kind of Lords of the Flies-esque thing going on, where he's kind of unruled. He like legally doesn't exist. He has no birth certificate, and it's kind of about his violence and also that of his brother, who is committed into some kind of institution throughout the book and is constantly trying to escape and get back to them. I can tell why I enjoyed this when I was 17, but I have to say I wasn't all that enamoured with it as an adult. I feel I've read much more interesting kind of books around that kind of young male violence and that kind of runaway masculinity, I guess, where people are trying to gain some kind of masculinity through the act of violence. It was okay, but I think it was something that I would have enjoyed much more when I was younger, so I kind of wish I hadn't lost it. But yeah, that's The Wasp Factory. And more short stories. What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours by Helen Oyeyemi. What a beautiful book, eh? This collection in general kind of focuses around the ideas of keys and things that are locked away and secrets. Some of the stories I really liked, and I kind of want to open with that because the beginning story, and actually the beginning kind of half of the collection, I really didn't like. And I think that's because in her kind of quest to add meaning, she took away a lot of the joy of the storytelling, and it became very complex very quickly, and you kind of felt as though you were working quite hard but getting not very much back, is how I felt about it. It does kind of weave lots of characters from different stories into one another's stories. But this is kind of device she uses where a character will start to tell a story and that story will then become the story, if that makes sense. Sort of become the whole of that story, and then it will refer back to the storyteller suddenly and you've completely forgotten there was a storyteller. And it just meant I was kind of turning back and forth, and overall the beginning wasn't all that enjoyable. As I say, I liked a few of them toward the end, but yeah, I didn't love it, to be honest. And the next one I'm not going to spend any great deal of time on, but I just wanted to show it to you. I finished War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. It took me forever. I bought this book on the 1st of January and I have just finished it, like, in September. I listened to an audiobook, which I think was much better than sitting down and reading it for me. I did like it. I think this is better as a novel than Anna Karenina, but I think it's much... there's so much going on. Like it's kind of one of those novels that looks at kind of every aspect of society, and it's very much sending a message. The one thing I will say about War and Peace, Tolstoy, you bugger, the very end of War and Peace is him having like a little diatribe about life and history and religion, and I'm like, you've made me read all of this book, I've got to read your last bit, but it's just so annoying. It's like a little thing that isn't even part of the story in the epilogue, and it pissed me off. I nearly didn't like finish listening to it, and I was like, but then you technically haven't read the book, and I feel like he did that just because of that. So yeah, I mean, it ended on a kind of like, you bastard note for me, but I did like the story, particularly sort of Nikolai's storyline, and I think in general I quite like the way it kind of dealt with the aftermath of war. That was kind of the bit for me that was the most interesting, and people building their lives back up after, but it covers so much it's kind of hard to chat about in a video like this. And the last fiction I have is Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. And this is a book that is sort of broadly about refugees and the refugee experience. So we sort of start out in an unnamed Middle Eastern country following this couple who are kind of trying to date whilst war is kind of just ravishing their city all around them, and they're kind of trying to explore and live their own lives in their hometown. And then these kind of magical doors start appearing all over the city that allow people to kind of slip between the world they're in and sort of an unnamed location in the west. So they'll kind of pop up somewhere. It might be London, it might be Paris, it might be Greece. But yeah, and we follow this couple as they slip through one of these doors and find out what happens to them afterwards and sort of what their lives look like. It is interesting, and I didn't give it 5 stars, which is, you know, it was another one of my 5-star predictions, but I did enjoy it. I think that I think it's very timely, as you know, lots of people have said, like his novels tend to be quite timely. But I don't know, I just didn't absolutely love it. I'm not sure what it was about it that maybe didn't get it that 5 stars. I think potentially I found the relationship a little cold, which may have been it, because it just meant I had a little bit of a level of disconnect between myself and the characters, and I knew it was a story the whole way through. I knew it was a book, I knew it was kind of talking about something rather than getting lost in the story, but that's kind of just my hunch, I guess. Okay, we're halfway there, that's the fiction done. So the first non-fiction I have is Why I Write by George Orwell. It's a short collection of essays by him. I didn't really like this. And it's not really any fault of this collection, it's just that Why I Write and Politics in the English Language I'd actually already read in other essay collections by him, so I was only left with The Lion and the Unicorn, which was an essay, sort of a really long essay talking about, I guess, kind of socialism and the future of UK politics, and A Hanging, which was a very short story about a hanging that Orwell saw when he was sort of acting as, I think he was like a police officer in one of the UK's colonies, something like that. But yeah, so unfortunately the 2 stories which I did really like in here I had already read, so I feel as though it's a little bit unfair to say I didn't like it, but I didn't love the 2 that I read in there. And the next one that I have is Never Use Futura by Douglas Thomas, and this is a book all about the typeface Futura and all the ways it's been used. I didn't realise I could be so interested in a book about typeface, but it's really nicely put together. There's lots of sort of pictures and illustrations around sort of the text itself that kind of make the story much more interesting, I guess. And I think, like, after, I've definitely had in my head that I'm looking for Futura everywhere. Yeah, it's the kind of thing where if you're like a really nerdy, like, typography person and you like that kind of stuff, or design in general, it's going to appeal to you. And I think as a kind of general interest book, it's made much more approachable by the number of illustrations and pictures and examples that is good. And the next one I have is a collection of essays, and it is The Mother of All Questions by Rebecca Solnit, and I really like this book. It was one of those ones that had me with a red pen, and as you guys know, that kind of is my, like, oh yes, I agree, or kind of commenting on it. It's a really lovely, like, book, like, it's really nicely put together. It's got these kind of charcoal drawings of women's hair separating each section, and I don't know, they really add to it somehow. They kind of have this traditional femininity, like, built in with these really hard-hitting essays. I would say that this is a really hard book to read if you've suffered from sexual abuse or sexual assault, because it approaches that topic really directly. There's no mollycoddling of the facts and the experience of people who've gone through that kind of thing. So just keep that in mind. I think even if you have suffered those kind of things, it's actually something that's well worth reading. And I say that knowing that it might be triggering, because it is really well done, and I felt this book was really important for me personally, and I wouldn't want to kind of dissuade people who've had that experience from reading it, because I think actually you might get quite a lot from it too, but just so you're aware when you're going in that is one of the main sort of themes of this book. And the next one I have is kind of creative non-fiction. It's not essays, I don't really know what I'd call it, but it's A Study in Imperfect by Sarah Gorham. And this is kind of a book that focuses around the idea of perfection and talks about what perfection is, what perfection means to different people. She gives some examples of her perfect things, like the perfect water, the perfect cup of tea, or whatever, and gives a kind of story about that. And it was just really good. Like, that, her kind of life experience is just really interesting, and there's a lot of kind of variety in what she's speaking about, and so it kind of goes from essays or sort of pieces on the perfection of a home and what a home is, and how she feels like a home is something that does its job at the time for those people. And also there was one that I found like just amazing that was talking about family, and she was talking about her sister, her younger sister, who's called Becky, who was born sort of profoundly retarded. She never passed the sort of mental age of about a 10-month-year-old through the whole of her life, so she wasn't able to walk or talk or sort of use a toilet or feed herself, and her talking about family and talking about Becky as well, and it was just, I don't know, it felt really as though she kind of invited you into her life a little bit, as well as kind of exploring this wider topic of perfection. And yeah, I definitely read more by her if I can find anything else by her, just because I really liked what she did, I guess, with the topic. And the next one I have is Testosterone Rex by Cordelia Fine. This is a book that talks about all of the myths that sort of are in society about testosterone, and how they can kind of bolster sexist attitudes, and she kind of breaks them down step by step. I think the book is interesting, but like the topic is interesting, but I didn't really like the execution. It's very dense, which it kind of has to be because she's referring to a lot of studies and a lot of other kind of people's opinions and papers, but it felt much more like a book that you were reading for school or for work than it did something you were reading for pleasure. It took me a long time to read, and at points I kind of felt as though I wish I had like a bullet point guide to it. I don't know, that's really mean, but it's just, I don't know, it just felt a little bit too academic for what I wanted from it. But yeah, really interesting things. Like I definitely have more like ammunition now for people when they're like, we've always been this way since we were cavemen and women must hold babies at all times, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I didn't love it as a book, unfortunately. And the next one I have is Lines in the Sand, which is collected journalism by A.A. Gill. And this goes over a number of different kinds of articles that he wrote during his life. He's now passed away. And kind of the first section, which is around kind of Lines in Sand, is talking about refugee camps all over the world. And the next section is talking about sort of broader kind of travel journalism, but he isn't kind of a holiday journalist, if that makes sense. He would travel to some places that aren't particularly nice and talk about them, as well as some travel journalism, a little bit of travel journalism, because he was a restaurant critic, so a lot of it is kind of around food as well. And the last bit is topics around the UK and kind of home-based things. Now, I really like the first section. I really like reading about the refugee camps, and there were certain ones in the kind of around the world topic that are really interesting for me because there are countries I don't know very much about, and I know I'm going to be reading them next year, so that was good. But his own sort of political leanings and him as a person I didn't get on with so much. So I think my enjoyment waned throughout the book as we went from refugee camps to sort of hard-hitting journalism about horrible places in the world to lovely holidays and then complaining about the NHS. I lost him. Yeah, so I kind of wish, like, maybe if you can find the essays on refugee camps, they're actually really good and I think they're really important, but I wasn't with him for the end of the book, I'm afraid. And then the next one I have is Utopia for Realists by Rutger Gregman, and this is a book that is talking about how we could kind of improve our society going forward, why it's important to keep trying to push ourselves to more and more utopian states, that's how progress happens, and mostly this book focuses around the idea of like a basic universal income, which I thought was interesting. I did enjoy it. I did think it was, you know, a good book, but I think I felt as though it kind of said the same point a lot. You know, I was kind of convinced by about here, and the rest of it I'm going, yeah, I got you, yeah, that's fine. But yeah, I mean, I think that a basic like universal income is a good idea anyway, but he's kind of breaking it down into why it's good for the people, why it's good for the taxpayers, how it actually saves money in the long run, why it's sort of good for the world. He talks a little bit about bringing in refugees and immigration, emigration, and how that affects the country, talking a little bit about GDP of a country and what that really means, how we measure success of countries. So yeah, it was interesting and enjoyable. I think it really was an enjoyable read. It was a very quick read as well. I read it in a couple of sittings, I think. But yeah, I think he was trying to convince me too hard. I was already there. And the next one I have is Blue Nights by Jane Didion. It's a fantastic book. She's talking about her daughter and the death of her daughter and the things that led up to the death of her daughter and how she knows her daughter. And it kind of broke my heart a little bit. When I finished reading it, I actually really badly wanted to send it to my mum. I didn't because I thought it would upset her too much, but the daughter in this story has BPD, she has what I have. And there's one thing that she tells her mum when she's a little girl. She asks her to let her go in the ground and just sleep. And I can't get that out of my head, like how perfectly that encapsulates like the reality of having BPD, especially when it's untreated and you're young. And her kind of knowing her daughter and dealing with her daughter and her daughter having this personality disorder and how that affected her life just really struck me really hard. As I say, I really wanted to send it to my mum, but I think it would upset her too much. It's a really fantastic piece of writing. It's just fabulous. Just you know, go read this one. And then the very last one I have to talk about is Ways of Seeing by John Berger. And this is a book kind of talking about art and how we see art and how we look at art, and I guess the way in which art changes over time. I like this a lot more than I thought I was going to. I kind of bought this because I was like, oh, I don't really know anything about art and I want to learn something about art. And then I was like, actually, yeah, do you know what, this is really interesting. I particularly liked sort of his commentary about the way in which women and men are seen in art, and the kind of supposed viewer of art, the way in which certain kinds of art, especially kind of oil paintings, was essentially a way of showing your wealth, and how he feels that kind of the advertising industry and celebrity now is taking over what that art form was. So it was much more than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was mostly going to be about painting and form and structure, I guess, more of the kind of physicality of art than it was about kind of the ideas around it. So yeah, I did enjoy it. It was not the kind of thing I'd normally read, so it was good for me just to stretch myself a little bit. I have a tower of books beside me and I've been talking to you for nearly half an hour. Yeah, I read quite a lot in September. I'm pretty happy with it overall. I'm bashing through my TBR. I'm going to be trying my hardest to keep up the pace through the last 3 months of the year to try and finish everything off. Yeah, hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. Hopefully you have settled your way through like a cup of tea or dinner or whatever it is you've been doing whilst I've been nattering on for so long. And I'll see you soon in my next video. Bye!